Okay, here we are, Lower Manhattan. It's Monday, December 3rd, day 6 of U.S. versus Patrick Ho, the case that has shown that the UN has become a venue for the sale of weapons to dictators for oil under the nose of Antonio Guterres, who refuses to audit the obvious evidence. His only response? Rough up and ban the press that asks. That would be inner city press. He's done it for 152 days in a row. But we're covering the trial, and then we're going to circle back to Big Tony's house of corruption. See, it's worse. Under Ban Ki-moon, it was just for money, okay? Under Ban Ki-moon, you just had a Chinese NGO paying money for a fake document for a casino in Macau. But what Tony is covering up, Antonio Guterres, he's covering up weapons sales, weapons offered to 30-year coup leaders. And it's because it calls into question all of the dubious notions. Not that they're perfectly fine notions. Sustainable development, that's great. Fighting climate change, fabulous. Corruption, selling weapons, supporting dictators, but that's what he's done. He did it in Cameroon. He's doing it now, covering it up in Chad, and he'll do it anywhere. We put in questions today to the noon briefing we're banned from for 152 days. Take a look at it. Go online, look at the noon briefing. Look at people asking the same question again and again. Look at no questions, not just about this trial, but about the cover-up of the killings in Cameroon. But Antonio Guterres' son doing business in Africa undisclosed. Just check it out. And then ask yourself, can the UN talk about freedom of the press when they can't handle a single critical journalist? Their only answer to someone that asks, how did Big Tony spend his money, is to have the journalist beaten up and thrown out, and then pontificate about freedom of the press. Well, no. We're going to day 6, and soon, this week, there'll be a verdict. And whatever the verdict is, the verdict as to the UN is clear. It's corrupt. And the Secretary General, who did nothing about all this corruption, is the problem. Whatever the Swedes say, whatever the European Union says, they have their head in the sand. They don't want to believe that all the fine concepts that make them feel good about themselves, that they sell to their populace to say, oh no, we're doing multilateralism. We're at the UN on SDGs. You check out China Energy Fund Committee, weapons to dictators in the name of sustainable development. Tony Guterres, nothing but censorship. Well, here it is. So we're going up. Here's the courtroom. We'll come out. Sorry, it's getting loud. We'll come out every time that we can. Day 6. The UN is corrupt. Okay, here we are outside the federal courthouse in the UN bribery case. U.S. versus Ho. Both sides have rested. Defense, government, and then defense. The charge conference begins. And soon, jury instructions. Summations, jury instructions. And the jury gets the case. And soon we'll know. What I can tell you is this. However the jury decides on Patrick Ho, whether there's sufficient nexus to a domestic concern and the various concerns raised by Mr. Rosenberg and his motion to dismiss, which was very quickly denied by Judge Preska, who also spoke a little bit about George H.W. Bush. Whatever the jury decides on Ho, the verdict as to the UN is clear. The UN is corrupt. The UN has allowed itself to become a venue for the trading of weapons for oil. And the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, doesn't even do an audit. He is covering up the sale of weapons to dictators in Africa while he flies around the world spending public money for private benefit and censoring the press that reports on it. Inner city press has covered this case from day one, and we will not rest, because to defile, to decimate all the stated lofty goals of the UN, turn it into a den of oil for weapons, is too much. Okay, now we're waiting to see, I guess, counselors come out. We've got a couple of photographers hanging around. We're going to be having a lot more about this case. The Trump Tower documents came on in, some bank records. It was a little bit of a letdown, I have to say, a little bit of a kind of a... and the trial, the evidence ended with a whimper and not a bang. But the bang is to come, because how can, let me ask you, how is it possible? How is it possible that the United Nations, the high table of multilateralism, is a place where a Chinese NGO can sell weapons to a dictator for oil and get a Secretary General to cover it up? It's just unfathomable. Also unacceptable. Capital N. UN acceptable. Not acceptable. To be continued. Okay, here we are. It's Monday, December 3rd. The 6th and perhaps penultimate day of the UN bribery trial of U.S. versus Patrick Ho. Both the defense and the prosecution rested in the morning, and in the afternoon, a full afternoon of arguments about the charges that Judge Preska will read. One of the more interesting diversions was an argument by the defense that New York might not mean Manhattan. And the prosecution went wild on that one and said, we can reopen our case and prove to you that 60 Wall Street is in Manhattan. Now, I was just conferring with some of the other journalists covering the case, mostly from Hong Kong. South China Morning Post, Apple News. It looks pretty clear. I mean, I don't know. They're not the jury. And who knows? All it would take was one juror to say, why is this case here? But the statute is what it is, and the evidence is overwhelming. The witnesses, less so. Yadio took bags of cash to run for president of Senegal in the past. Vuk Jeremic was making potash and potassium deals while PGA. The most guilty party, whatever happens to Patrick Ho, the most guilty party in this trial is the United Nations. And the most shameful performance is not the defense, but Antonio Guterres, who is killing the United Nations by not even auditing and continuing to accredit an NGO that sold weapons inside the UN while acting against the media that covered it. To be continued.